back to day 3 of ECGC, folks. Next up, we've got Alexander Brazie, the founder and CEO of Game Design Skill, and he's going to be talking about the art and science of guiding gameplay. You might want to listen. He's been working with studios like Blizzard and Riot and Microsoft for years, so this should be a good one. Hold your questions or put your questions in chat, and we'll get to them at the end. But with that, Alexander, it's all yours.
Hey, nice to be speaking with you guys. Glad you've taken the time out here to come and check out my talk. So I'm sure a lot of you were curious about, hey, if you're going to be building gameplay, how can you do it? How can you do it better? And so let's get right into this talk. So what is this all about? Well, you know, at the root of things, right, we're all human beings. And we're all experiencing things through our life. And one of the most powerful categories of feedback and experience that we have is that of pain, right? And as a developer of video games, you often have to be incredibly tuned in to what kind of pain your players are going through. And so the goal of this talk is to kind of like understand the kind of situations when the pains happen, why they happen, and be conscious of when to alleviate them and take pain away. And also, on the flip side, be considerate of when to let pain remain because it's performing a useful function. Now, you might be sitting here and wondering, you know, who is this guy and why should I listen to him? And, you know, that's an excellent question. If you just listen to everybody, you'll be listening to nobody, right? At that point, why even bother? So here's kind of where my background is. I've been a game designer at Blizzard Entertainment for 7 years. I became a systems designer, which is like a game designer who handles bigger spectrum, kind of the zoomed out lens of things at Riot Games. And then I was senior game designer on Ori 2, Will of the Wisps, which came out this past year in 2020. And, you know, working through all of this diverse set of experiences, right, has taught me so much, right? I began when I was 13 years old working at a French video game company called Cyberjour. I made a little top-down Zelda game called Growl Online, right? But snowballing through, you know, now 26 years of game design experience, I've kind of realized there are certain patterns and habits and things that you need to see in order to be able to create great player experiences, which at the heart of everything is what we want to do, right? Some of us are here to tell stories, some of us are here to build the gameplay, but at the end of the day, we're here to craft an experience. Now, just as a heads up, this is my first time doing this specific talks. There might be some rough edges. Drop in any questions or comments you have along the way. And if something doesn't seem to be clear, I'll try to fix it as we go. All right. So what have I created? Well, on World of Warcraft, I made dungeons, raid bosses. I actually helped design the Death Knight class, doing a huge number of talents, as well as the core rune system. I built the entire pet battle system on World of Warcraft. That's the, you know, turn-based Pokemon-like game. I did the Warlock revamp, which is taking the Warlock class apart and rebuilding it for Mists of Pandaria, which is probably what I'm most famous for. This was a really player fantasy focused project where I did a ton of mechanical changes and kind of kept the core of the class's spirit while ripping out the heart of the guts and rebuilt everything. I did a number of PvP battlegrounds, and over on League of Legends, I did the Xerath rework, which was rebuilding one of the popular but toxic characters. As well as doing the support redesign, right? Supports in season 3 basically didn't make money and they just sat around dropping rewards. I took that head on and figured out ways for supports to earn income while doing beneficial and supportive actions in their lane with their laner. And a ton of other stuff, right? On Ori, I've worked on UI and combat stuff and built systems. And, you know, I've worked with other companies building entire game design docs and so on. All right. So why does player pain matter enough for an entire talk? Well, because we have such a reflexive, you know, reaction to pain, we often look at it as something that absolutely has to be avoided. But pain is actually a fundamental tool. It informs you, right, of what's going on in your world. Are you too close to something that's hot, dangerous? It protects you by saying, hey, you need to get away from this. And sometimes it needs to be overcome, right? You need to, you know, get away from the pain and just push through it and do something. Sometimes you need to avoid it and prevent it from happening again. And I just want to emphasize this concept, though, that pain itself is not problematic, but unconscious, excessive, or haphazard use of pain is, right? You want players to be going through that emotional experience when they're going through the feedback time. They're playing them against a monster the wrong way and they die and they get a little frustrated and need to push back, right? People often tend to pull out the Dark Souls example here, right? Like, oh, Dark Souls is such a great game because it's so hard and it's so painful. But actually the trick of Dark Souls is that it comes off that way, but it's actually a very carefully crafted game to put you through experiences that challenge and make you frustrate and struggle you, but always keep pulling you ahead as you see incremental tiny bits of progress, right? That's where they were very conscious about where and when they applied pain, or when they would do something like kick you off a cliff, which we'll get to in a little bit. All right, but before we can talk about pain, first we need to talk about the core responsibilities of a designer, all right? And keep in mind that your role as a designer is to craft a full experience for the player. And even if you're doing this as a hobby or an art or concept piece where your goal is purely an emotional one, or a challenging analytical game where your goal is to solve these kind of complex puzzles, you have a responsibility to be in tune with player emotions. Now, most of you guys out there, right, are going to come from one of two schools of thought. Either one, you're really naturally in tune with emotion, you apply it subconsciously, or you're a highly intellectual, rational person who kind of like pulls your emotions out of the decisions you make. And you know what? If you're on either one of these poles, you might be like, why am I here? I already know how to use emotion, or I don't need emotion to make good decisions. But it's actually the merging of those two disciplines and balancing them between them that makes it so important, right? If you're unconsciously using emotions right now, you might be doing it well for a certain audience, but if you aren't consciously, awarely doing it, you're not going to be able to reapply those lessons in a different context. Likewise, if you're pulling emotion out of all of your decisions, you're missing a really powerful tool that you can mix into your gameplay. All right. So this means that understanding how the gameplay you craft, has both immediate, situations and responses, like, oh God, that thing scared and startled me. And the long-term impact, like, oh God, this game is dragging on and I'm so exhausted, within that player's spectrum, right? You need to know when to weigh these off, right? Because, being beaten by a boss sucks. You feel that immediate sense of frustration, or, oh, I should have gotten it, or we're so close, or I don't see any way I could possibly beat this, right? And throw the controller down. But, if you continuously put the player in a situation where they feel like they're making progress and learning, the eventual satisfaction, that long-term satisfaction of overcoming a struggle that was ahead of them, can be incredibly powerful and really anchor players into your game. Likewise, the little emotional minor offsets of like losing a character who seems appealing and close to you, as we did at the beginning of Ori, or I don't want to spoil things with others. Some of the other major moments in Will of the Wisps, right? They're emotional setbacks that end up setting you up for the greater long-term satisfaction. But how do you do this, right? Here I am explaining these things, like I said, some people do this intuitively, but some people need to learn, and that's okay. And, even intuitive people tend to not be methodical in their approach. And that's what I'm going to try to kind of walk you through, is some of the methods you can apply to consciously apply emotion to your gameplay. So the first thing you need to understand is the biology, that human hardware, right, of every single gameplay experience. And this is something I teach in one of my design courses. And it's that satisfaction itself is composed of 4 steps. 1, what do you sense, right? What are the stimuluses coming into your eyes, your hands, your ears, etc.? Then the human body has an immediate emotional reaction we call our feelings, right? I see something coming at me really fast. I feel a sense of fear, right? This happens before any logical, rational thought occurs. Then that flood of emotion flows into the brain, and then an interpretation process happens, right? I feel this paralysis. I see this emotion flooding in, and then I interpret it as, oh, I'm in danger. And then you make a conscious or reflexive decision on how to act. Now, one of the people in the audience may ask a really smart question, right? Is player pain just frustration? But no, it actually goes far, far beyond just frustration. I just picked the easiest, most familiar example that we have. All right. So this whole cycle you see here is the loop, right? Information comes in, You feel something, you think about it, you act, and then whatever you do in your game gives the feedback. Did they take the right course or the wrong course? And I need to emphasize that this is just more than high-minded theoretical mumbo jumbo. This is the stuff you should be thinking about continuously as you're building your gameplay, right? And why? Well, let's go into each of these steps, these 4 steps, and where failures within them inflict different kinds of pain, all right? So the first one is when you're unable to interpret what's happening in front of you. You know, the sensory information, the noise going on in front of you is cluttered or messed up. You're going to go into a state of confusion, right? If you're unable to feel or have an emotional response, be it fear or anger or excitement or what is the right word here? Attention, right? But then you're not going to be motivated or not curious about what's happening because it just had no effect upon you, right? Then if you're unable to act, you're going to feel paralyzed and unable to act and just kind of get that kind of sense of anger and barrier between you and the experience you want to create. Then finally, if you're unable to sense that what you did, the action you took upon the game world that you're building had any effect, you're going to disengage from the game. Right? You're going to feel like, what did I do? It made no effect. You attack the boss. One of my favorite examples here is Monster Hunter. Plenty of people play Monster Hunter, enjoy it, understand it, but I go in and I strike that giant dinosaur. It doesn't flinch, doesn't react, and I don't see even a sliver of health happen on that hit point bar. I feel like I've made no progress. So what should you do, right? You don't want to be bringing any of those negative emotions unconsciously to the table. So start by asking yourself these questions. First question is, can I make the game better by making it clear, right? Can you make it more transparent what is happening in the world in a way that they don't need to consciously overanalyze every single moment of the gameplay? This next question is, can you make the game better by connecting with the player's motivations, right? Players don't just show up here, unmotivated and uninterested. There's a reason they joined your game. There's something that intrigued them. There's some reason within every scene and every screen and every moment they spend in their game that there is something they are after, and they believe that interacting with your game is going to connect them to that outcome. All right. So the more you understand that and what they're going through, this might be a power reward. It might be a great challenge. It might just be a beautiful scene or a landmark in the distance that they're going to struggle and try to reach, right? Then you might ask, can I make the game better by giving them more ways of responding to various situations, right? My favorite example there is Ganondorf, way back in the old Nintendo game, Super Nintendo game, right? You're supposed to use the Master Sword and knock missiles back at him. And or Dalim, whatever. But they actually allowed, what if you swing a butterfly net? It makes no sense, but sure, let's do it. They actually allowed it. So if you pulled out the butterfly net, it was slower, it was more ridiculous. But this all of a sudden gave you a different tool to utilize in that same missile situation where you can bounce the missile back. Likewise, you can think about, they did a lot of this in Breath of the Wild. There are so many different types of ways to deal with the monster camps. You can sneak up slowly, or you can levitate a giant metal block from somewhere and drop it on the enemies, or you can throw bombs in the environment, or you can set the environment on fire with fire arrows and then deal with the bubble links as they panic and run around, right? Giving players more ways of responding to situations gives them a greater sense of agency. But obviously that comes with the risk. You can go too far. We'll come back to that. Next, you ask, can you make the game better by creating satisfying feedback to your actions, right? And that's, hey, once you're building and constructing things, are you really giving them the information that what they are trying to do is succeeding, failing, or having some secondary side effect that they didn't expect, right? How many times have you been surprised in a game when you say something to one NPC and it ends up having a completely different effect, or a dialogue tree, the NPC thing says, so-and-so will remember that. Well, what will they remember? How do they react? I don't know, right? But if you gave enough feedback, you can kind of see the disgust in their eyes or the delight, or even something as simple as the Mass Effect games where they say, so-and-so +1 reputation or plus Paragon or plus Renegade, right? Communicates to you which direction you're going. All right, so let's go through a bunch of example emotions, right? The first one here is confusion. And confusion is very often caused by a lack of clarity, right? The player doesn't really deeply understand what's going on beneath the hood. And for example, I'm going to pick out this game right here. It's Nuclear Throne. What the F is going on in this game screen right now, right? I'm just looking at it and I'm like, how many bullets are on screen? There's all of these green things. I guess those could be dollar bills. Maybe they're ammo. Maybe they're just noise and clips left over, right? Now, I know the answers to these things. I haven't played it, but I just look at this game and there is so much going on, so much for me to absorb that it's only through rote experience and a sense of numbing out, right, what the actual experience is that I start to understand the patterns. I start ignoring things in order to build a clear enough model in my own head. But by comparison, you look at Binding of Isaac, right? And I probably should have made this image a little bigger, but bear with me, right? Look how clear this environment is. What are the most important things on screen? Well, Isaac himself is thickly, outlined. And look at the outlines on the outside of the characters themselves, right? Those are the dangerous, risky elements on the screen right now. The other things, right? The challenges, the doors, things like that. It says that on screen right now, these things don't matter as much. Now, the crazy thing, Binding of Isaac has way more complexity than Nuclear Throne, right? At the end of the day, it has more skills and combinatorial permutations for what can be happening. But they did a better job of representing what do I need to pay attention to right now and what can I let go, right? The health, the whole Zelda UI at the top pulls those UI elements away, meaning that I don't need to worry about what's behind there. I never need to think there's going to be gameplay elements going on up there that are going to be shooting at me down from the other screen. All right. So here's another great example of clarity, right? This is Slay the Spire. Now, Slay the Spire does something really cool. It's a little hard to see in this picture, but they use color and resources and iconography in a way that keeps their game incredibly consistent and connects elements of the game together. The cost on the top left corner of the card is the same as the resource on the left. The hostile actions of the character are in orange. The supportive effects can be in blue. Enemy actions are consistent, right? This creates this sense of consistency. And furthermore, if you look at the art here, right, the characters, while being simple and hand-drawn, stand out. All of the interactive elements stand out from the background itself. By comparison, Cyberpunk's UI is a nasty mishmash of colors. It's got so much inconsistent data and unclear sense of flow, right? Why are some of these blue? Why are some of these yellow? Why are some of these red? You can only tell, right, is by interacting with this system over a large period of time. Now, this bit about skill progression down in the corner, do I need to know about that right now? Turns out you actually don't, right? It's just a progress meter towards some additional effects going on. Is it super clear that you can swap from tab to tab? I mean, a lot of the interactions here. And what's crazy is I actually look at the actual skills developed here. Lots of interesting skills, and the guy who developed and designed the mechanics himself is great. But this choice of flow and UI layout is just sprawling and maddening, right? I have to look really carefully to understand this implies this, and oh, yellow is a completed talent, while a blue one is an incomplete talent, a red is inaccessible, right? Just, ugh. Whereas by comparison, right, look at the tech tree in Civ, I believe, I can't remember if this is 4 or 6, but it flows very simply, right? And it's probably just as complicated, if not more complicated, than the one we just saw, but it flows from left to right. There's a explanation, a key on the left-hand side that says, hey, what do I need to understand? Oh, gray ones I can't pick up. Oh, these are in progress. These are being developed as they go, right? I've got a nice little progress meter showing me how far I am along researching sailing, okay? Again, just remember that the art does so much to clearly communicate what's important, what's not important, and what do I interact with and what is it safe to ignore. All right, the next emotion here I want to talk about is disinterest, right? And for example, here I'm going to talk about one of the least popular champions in classic League of Legends. This was Yorick. Now, There's an interesting story about Yorick, which I can't tell in full, but my good friend Stephen DeRose was working on this guy, and they basically had to build this guy in, I believe, a week and a half. And anyone who knows anything about champion design now, most champions can be sitting for 3 months to almost a year during that whole development process. So he had to build a simple set of mechanics to hit the expected number of champions they'd release. And they took this idea of, oh man, let's do a cool Undertaker. But at the end of the day, that fantasy was undersold, right? The Q skill was smack the enemy with a shovel. The W skill, I can't even remember, right? And the third one was like basically just do some damage to the target. And then the ultimate was like, hey, let's duplicate this ally of mine with a ghost. And if they die, they take over the ghost, right? It ended up being this weird mishmash of very basic skills and power, but it just wasn't satisfying. The ghouls weren't meaningful. They were just kind of this noise that enemies didn't know, do I interact with it? Do I not interact with it? And so people just kind of disengaged from that character. They didn't see, why do I really want to play this guy except for being the guy who is underplayed? Enemies didn't understand, do I interact with the ghouls? Do I care about them or do I ignore them? And it was generally okay either way, right? They didn't make clear, impactful, and significant gameplay. All right. Emotion number 3, frustration, right? This happens when you don't understand exactly why the systems in the game are working the way they want to work. And this is a screenshot from Kerbal Space Program, right? Now, Kerbal Space Program is where you build rockets and launch them into space, but you might have something off balance or mess something up or not have some value set to the right, piece of right value, and your rocket just blows up on the launch pad, which ironically is also very realistic and legit to the actual experience of building rockets. And while the game gives you information, and you could actually watch the rocket going up yourself, it can also be super challenging to figure out exactly how a design could be improved or why one particular decision you made over here all of a sudden has snowballing decisions down here that are going to lead to complete and utter project failure, right? And that can be incredibly frustrating. Now, the next emotion I want to talk about is letdown. Now, let's talk about one of the games where, frankly, victory is not that impressive, right? This is the first game that was ever made. This was Pong. And the heart of Pong is you have 2 paddles and you bounce a ball back and forth, Perfectly fine game. My father loved playing it with his brothers when they were growing up, right? But eventually you hit 10 score and it goes, and that's it. That's it, right? You just know that you've won by seeing it on screen. There was no sort of banner saying, hey, you won, or any sort of ceremony or any sort of celebration, right? So now, again, they didn't have these expectations, these understandings of what you should do to kind of celebrate the player moments at the end of the game. And so, right. So, you have to understand that, hey, that's where it came from. But if you go back and play it now, the reason this game isn't as impressive, isn't as memorable now, is because of a lack of that letdown, or that this game seems so simple. Another example is Lackluster Ceremony, right? It's actually more of a bridge from the last one. This game, and I'm just, I'm going to dignify it with the names, but literally you go in this incredibly difficult game, and at the very end, you get to the end, and it's basically like you rescue the president, right, from danger, and he goes, hey dudes, thanks for rescuing me, let's go for a burger, ha 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 ha. What? Really? Is that what you want to do? You want to go for a burger with the president after rescuing him? No badge or ceremony, just right. It's literally just one of the most flat end of game, congratulations on winning. It's not even it's barely a thank you, right? And this is one of the things that we've just learned and developed so well, is how to create these ceremonies, moments, and emotions to really reinforce, victory and defeat, right? Even defeat can be celebrated. In Dark Souls, we do the "you died," or for the Runeterra, we do the shattering of the crystal, and you see the big ceremony, right? Because for victory or for loss, if you celebrate it in a sufficiently interesting and memorable way, it kind of locks in that emotion and creates that sticky, satisfying experience. All right. Now, another emotion that you run into a lot is disengagement. Now, this emotion tends to happen in things like, where you just don't understand why something is meaningful. You look at it, you're confused, and just kind of walk away, right? There's no feedback on what you're doing and how it matters. In this game, because it was full of pre-rendered scenes, right, couldn't interact and respond to you in real time saying, hey, as you interact with this thing, it's useful, right? For example, in this particular scene, there in Mist, there's a chair that you click on it and you look up into the night sky and just see stars. And there's no hints as to why you're there. You get there and you're just confused, right? You're like, cool. Is this decorative? Does this have some greater meaning? And there's just no clue on how to proceed. There's no interactable to tell you, hey, some other part of the room might be interactable, or that some other part in the world needs this information and that you should jot it down. Now, again, we've moved on so much from this period, but this is just a strong example of the type of things that you'll run into in your own games, right? If the player is losing over and over again in a mad game of League of Legends or against a raid boss, they don't understand why, but they don't have like other raiders to teach them or other lessons to learn from or things to guide them to indicate, hey, you shouldn't be standing there, right? They're not going to be able to learn, grow, and adapt, and that's what makes this game so much fun. All right, the next emotion I want to talk about is disgust. And disgust can come in a couple of forms. Aside from the emotional disgust that can come with artistic choices, like in Binding of Isaac, I want to focus on disgust with gameplay that is born out of feeling cheated, used, or misled. Sometimes this is done for narrative reasons, and reasonably so. Other times it just comes at you out of like an ambush. This is a scene where a character you've been trusting in the game kicks you down into a pit, and all of a sudden you have to fight your way out. This sets the player up for a revenge arc, where they very much want to get back into there and fight again. Figure out who this guy is and what was he doing. But there are many, many, many more negative and positive emotions that can exist within the game, right? And so your reaction to all of this stuff, as I've talked about how these emotions can be things that you can design and improve, right? These are all bad, aren't they? Well, not necessarily. You need to understand that as you're going through the experience of creating a game, right? I'm not sure you'll be able to see my mouse, but let's say you're starting over here. You're going to be charting a path through a series of design choices, right? You can make this choice or that choice, this choice or that choice, right? And eventually it'll lead you to discover, what type of stuff works for your game and doesn't work for your game. And, a lot of people tend to think that this is how it works, right? There are decisions that are just universally bad, decisions that are universally good, and let's pretend that this is about difficulty. Like this is a high difficulty situation, this is a low difficulty situation. But you just can't assume that what works for you is what works for everybody, right? The expectations and context a player comes to the game with defines the different types of experience, right? What might be completely reasonable in a Dark Souls game, let's say up here in the yellow section, is completely unreasonable in the difficulty margin of, say, Candy Crush, right? And likewise, what might be a perfectly reasonable thing in between the two is just completely boring and not even interesting, right? What is high difficulty for Candy Crush might be low difficulty and disinteresting in Dark Souls, and vice versa, right? So you need to understand this really simple concept, right? Emotions are about pushing the player as far as they can go within the boundaries of what is within their expectations and things they are willing to accept within a game. Players who came to Dark Souls for a challenging experience they need to learn were thus more willing to endure certain types of pain. People who go into something like Candy Crush, right, are looking for a satisfying, simple, puzzling experience that they can disengage from at any moment without any significant consequences. And so, the idea of sitting down and spending hours trying to overcome a particular boss really or a level wouldn't work for the Candy Crush audience because they're not committing to that multiple hours of play session per time. Whereas something that they can repeatedly, consistently solve in 3 seconds, right, just isn't going to be interesting and engaging for long for the Dark Souls type players. Okay. So look, your reaction to this might be like, oh man, you're suggesting all of these ideas and rules, but you know what? I'm really good at this. I'm so good at design, you don't even understand. I'm going to break all of the rules you suggest here. Everything. I don't need to worry about communicating stuff. My game's going to be obscure, and you're going to figure everything out and fight tooth and nail through it, right? Well, you know what? You do you. It's okay. I'm not the container of all knowledge and the perfect path for everything in this game, in the universe, right? For example, but at the end of the day, right, mistakes are absolutely the fastest way to learn. But I'm going to just say that this is the guide to get you started, right? If you don't know where to go, follow these types of rules. And if you are conscious and very intentionally deviating from some of the stuff I'm about to describe, that's totally fine. If you're doing a, kind of a horror mystery game, you don't want the player to have power to defeat the monster every time they encounter it. It doesn't work for your genre, right? But constantly breaking or disregarding what works consistently will eventually lead to ruin, disengagement, and just frustration with your game. Give me a second to drink some water here, guys. All right. And if you don't believe me, I want you to go download this free game off of Steam. It's called Hostile User Interface. This was made by a student at RIT last year, or 2 years ago now. And it has a very simple concept. What if the things you think should work the way they should never do, right? And it's probably about a 5-minute, 7-minute experience. But it just reminds you of how many of these preconceived rules and lessons we have embedded in our own mind about how to interact with games, gameplay, and interfaces that without us really internalizing, understanding, and sticking to them, we create unnecessarily frustrating moments for the player, right? All right, so let's keep going. I highly recommend you check this out. It's just a great design experience. It'll take you 5 minutes. So let's get back on course, right? Let's talk more about these emotions, right? And look, there are numerous ways to describe the emotional cocktails that occur. But at the heart are the core emotions, right? Which are fear, right? Need to flee, anger, the need to remove a barrier from your way, disgust, the need to protect yourself from internal damage and poisoning, sadness, the disconnection from things that matter to you, happiness, the positive reinforcement of an outcome you worked towards being satisfied, surprise, the twist and unexpected happening that demands your attention immediately, and anticipation, right, which is the belief and goal that you're watching intensely for something to occur. And lastly, trust, right? That not sense of safety, that within the framework you exist, things will generally work, right? Those 8 things are at the root of all human experiences. So let's go ahead and examine some of these as a starting point. All right. And I just want to call out something really wise that one of the commenters just said here. Lucas Game talks about RNG and its overuse, that it leads to negative reactions. And I want to be I want to just throw a little tidbit in here. And this is by Paul Stefanok, designer of Candy Crush and Frontierville. RNG, right? Random stuff. We tend to think random is cool, but in truth, random is actually saying I want streaks to happen. Wins, a bunch of wins and a bunch of losses back to back, then I'm okay with that. When in fact, usually what you want is variance, an unpredictable order for good and bad scenarios to be thrown at you for you to cope with, but never be stuck in too many highs or too many lows for too long. So very smart comment there, and totally great. Glad you brought that up. And that leads to a lot of frustration, confusion, and uncertainty because you can't trust the system in front of you. Yeah. And by the way, random RNG can be fine if it's constrained carefully by the designer. If it's not, you're going to be incredibly frustrated. Okay, so let's get back on the course. So when we're creating gameplay, we often start out with gray boxes, right? Very simple spaces that communicate the minimum amount of information you need to just go and interact. Go over to the shelf, grab the cup, take it to the fountain, leave the room. All of that is communicated by this simple level design. Well, likewise, the emotional topography of your game is going to be rough as well. You're going to start and you'll be like, cool, this is interesting. Oh, this is frustrating. Oh my God, I don't get it. And then you're just going to be stuck in this super negative cycle of this is broken, this is frustrating, right? And that is a natural initial state for any game. Do not beat yourself up because you start there, right? It's like, It's okay to go into this downward spiral. But just like with art, right? You can, through crafting and improving, increase the experience, the detail. And basically with time, attention, and careful thought, you can make it better. So just like before, where we had that downward slide that just stayed in the negative emotions, we can also use emotions to create texture, to the overall experience. Walk into a room and be surprised, and then be dropped down into fear as suddenly you're thrown in with a monster, frustrated till you overcome it, and then a sense of badassery when you beat it, and then being ready to go on to the next fresh new challenge, right? And look, so many designers do this unconsciously. They don't stop and really think, what emotion do I want the player to be experiencing moment to moment? Or they think, and they just kind of like, let me do this here and this there and this there, right? And I'll be honest, the super thinker guys, you don't tend to think about it at all, right? You don't apply any process where you disregard the emotional thing. And then the super thinky types, you just kind of do it, and you don't really think about this cadence at a logical level to make sure you're not staying in the highs or the lows for too long, right? And you might often just react to what the environment art is. But other times this can be planned, right? You come into a brand new area and you feel pleased with yourself. You find a secret passageway up to the ceiling and you feel really cool for having gone off the beaten path. Then you go down into a baseline emotion where there's nothing too important going on for a bit, and it's just kind of a place for you to like decompress and look around. Then you can go downstairs and get frustrated by a dead end that doesn't have the stuff you're looking for, and turn a corner and be surprised by a secret passage that leads to a terrifying chamber of sorcery and necromancy as sacrifices are playing out in front of you at the bottom of the lovely inn that you thought you could be in here, And for those of you who play games like Dungeons & Dragons, right, a Dungeon Master could just think about the content that they're creating. But just like a Dungeon Master, you can get a bigger impact by thinking about an emotional spectrum you want the players to be navigating as you're going through the entire experience. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're doing. We're creating mechanical and emotional experiences for players to navigate. So, for example, I want to talk about one of the very first raids in World of Warcraft, Naxxramas. Now, I was back, Naxxramas was one of the first raids that I got to work on way back in Brown Box. And it was mostly done at that point, right? I just joined the team as they were developing it. But the mission given to the team was, hey, take this giant floating, necropolis, it's basically this fortress, and make it interesting. And it was actually kind of challenging because their first pass was to create a singular environment that was consistent, looked very much like the Undercity, and something you fought through. But players often got lost and confused in navigating that space. It was very symmetrical. It was kind of just too easy to get lost, right? So instead, rather than focusing just on that core theme of undeath, they decided to break it up into quarters. And each quarter had a different emotional flavor, even though the overall arching theme was uncertainty and death, or undeath, right? They used the sense of creepy, cobwebby feels to create this, sense. And even you listen to the audio, the sound of those spiderlings chittering and running around on the inside gave you the sense of, you never know where the enemy is going to come from, right? Covered in cobwebs and artistically reinforced really well. Other parts were covered in green slime, and the hazards themselves were very consistent and predictable, and you just needed to navigate around the slime while going about your gameplay, right? A mechanic that was actually sold in the final boss fight. Others were all about an overwhelming sense of monsters that you could never truly defeat and simply needing to power through it as quickly and responsibly as possible. This one was full of this nasty toxic gas that made it hard to see, so you wouldn't want to stay in those places for very long, right? Each of these kind of took these different senses of aversion, disgust, frustration, and even something as cold and frigid as the final area, right? Because this is the last place you stayed, to really reinforce the emotional and mechanical topography of the environment itself. But holy shit, that was a lot of examples, and I'm sure you guys are starting to check out here, so let's try to wrap this up. Look, the point is, and the reason for all these examples, is that the environment itself is the most transparent example of emotional sensory navigation, right? It's the thing we look at and we immediately respond to, but it's not the only thing, right? I want you to look at something as simple as level 1-1 from the original Mario Brothers, way back in the day. Now, you might look at this and having played a lot of jumping games, know immediately how to solve it. But the player who never experienced this before, all of a sudden has this entire emotional cadence they go through in the first 30 seconds of the game. So I'm going to break this down for you. The player comes in and they're immediately kind of surprised and delighted as Mario falls from the sky down into landing. Lets him know that, hey, falling is not a risk or a danger here. Then they kind of get bored for a bit as they walk safely from left to right. They can't move left. So the game encourages them to the right. Then all of a sudden a threat, a dangerous looking Goomba comes on screen. Then a sense of, kind of fear as they have to overcome. And by the way, it took me like 50 tries to get past the Goomba because I was like 3 years old. I couldn't get that, coordinated timing right. Then this sense of kind of intrigue and confusion, right? As they have these box with question marks, question marks have this, sort of interesting, kind of thing going on with it. And then when the mushroom itself actually pops out and starts moving, you don't know, is this friendly or is this danger, right? And it actually bounces into the pipe itself, and you can't really jump over the mushroom, the power-up mushroom this time, as you're fighting through this area. It touches you, and then you discover, oh, hey, I'm bigger now. This is cool. And then eventually you learn how to control your A presses and hold the jump button, and now you've gotten over the pipe, and you know all of the skills you absolutely need to have to beat this game. And you've gone through an entire litany of excitement, boredom, fear, curiosity, and delight in just the first 30 seconds of the game. And guess what? This type of mapping, this marking of the emotions you go through from room to room, situation to situation, can be done for any game genre. Grab some level design maps and try it out for yourself. And look, there are just too many nuances to cover them all in an hour. So I'm going to pick out a few emotions and kind of break down their meaning for the players. All right. At the heart, I want you to keep in mind this core concept. Language itself is super powerful. And it conveys many things: the root emotion, the interpretation of the emotion by the mind, and the direction of the source from that emotion. Almost all words, especially in the emotion wheel I'm going to show you guys, and you can pick this up just by Googling it, exists here. And so if you take each of those emotions, this is just 6 of the most popular ones, and break them down, right? There's the core emotion, the interpretation, and then do you internalize or externalize that emotion? And again, there's too many words on screen here, so let's just zoom in on a few of them. For example, you start with the root feeling of sadness, which is that sense of loss, right? Kind of a negative feedback for having been separated from something that you wanted or desired. Then there's a subtype, the interpretation, which can be guilty, right? A sense of the nagging sense of attachment to that thing that has been lost, right? And then there's 2 different expressions of it. There's remorseful, where the sense of guilt is brought by you and your own sense of internal emotions and conviction, right? Like, oh, I feel so bad about that. And then there's ashamed, where entities outside are the initiating source of that sense of guilt, right? And likewise, you can also tell where the player's focus is. Are they on their own internal actions and their own growth? Or is it upon overcoming the social pressure around that emotion created, right? And this is a mirror for experience, right? Because in just the same way, right, we as human beings can either take cues from internal sources, our heart, right? What do we want to do and desire to do and go after it? Or we can see external stimuli forcing us. In both of these cases, right, player wants to move, but one is they've chosen to move because they desire something, and the other is they choose to move to avoid something harsh and punishing. So let's go ahead. I'm going to just turbo through this. We have time for questions. Let's pick a few of these and examine some examples in gameplay. And I'm going to depict suspicion, aversion, vulnerability, perplexion, overwhelm, and playful. So suspicion occurs when you only have some of the information that you need about a situation. But you're never suspicious unless what you care about, the care level of the situation you're in, is super high. But it's paired with an uncertain sense of what will happen in the outcome of the situation you're in. And it often tends to be super satisfying because either you perform the action and you discover, hey, this is indeed a monster and not a chest, or it is a chest, I can safely loot it, right? But it's very much focused outward, right? This is not a questioning of the self, it's a questioning of others. Aversion right here is expressed in the sense of danger towards all of these crazy threatening spikes, right? In this case, aversion happens when it's really clear you need to stay away from this. And you bother to actually change your behavior to avoid the spikes because you really care. And it doesn't really have much of a response, right? You're either touching it or not touching it. So you don't have a good response should you interact with it. So there's no reason to engage with it if you can avoid it. So you avert from it. And lastly, you can get a great sense of satisfaction by accurately navigating the environment. Then there's overwhelm, right? Which, so one of the people in the chat earlier mentioned Toho games, right? Toho games are entirely a sense of coping with being overwhelmed through the bullet hell mechanics, right? And this is one where the clarity itself is super low unless you've been playing these games and memorizing these patterns over a long period of time. You care a hell of a lot because it's literally live or die by a single hit. And the responses there, you have very few options for what you can do. You can just move, and you need to move in the right pattern at the right time. And for me, at least, I feel like the satisfaction for this sense of overwhelm, maybe not Toho games, right? Because people come in for this experience. But in general, the sense of being overwhelmed is highly dissatisfying because you don't know what's going on, you don't know what to do, and when you do get out of it, you just feel a sense of relief. Likewise, feeling vulnerable within a situation, right? You feel right, that sense of clarity. Oh no, I'm in danger. You care a lot because it's a lethal situation. But you haven't quite figured out yet what the solution or the way to overcome it is. You feel that unclear sense of response. And frankly, it's an incredibly satisfying experience when you do overcome it. And when you do understand, oh, hey, it was okay that I'm vulnerable in this situation because I can eventually overcoming it. All right. Then almost second to last here, we have awe, right? Awe happens when you just walk into a situation. It is immensely clear. It is emotionally stimulating and you care about it and creates that strong emotional response that truly sticks with you, right? This screenshot from The Witcher showing off a beautiful mountain distance you can run up to if you want to move far enough. And creates a great sense of satisfaction as you are connected with the experience before you, both mind, body, and action, right? And this leads me to the last one I want to talk about here, which is playful. And playful is interesting because unlike awe, which is just a sense of just a great sense of all of these things going off at once, playful can only happen when you're in a state of high clarity about what's going on around you. And you're in a situation where you care, but not so much that you are in a state of arousal and fear where you feel like you could mess up and destroy things forever, right? You need to feel a sense of safety. Playful also occurs when you feel the sensation that, hey, what you do in the game matters and has outcomes that you can navigate. And the results of those outcomes are things that are incredibly satisfying and driven either by internal motivation, like the decoration of this house itself, or external motivation by overcoming the tools and the mechanics, right, in the game itself, and overcoming the challenge and feeling satisfied that way, right? And then you feel a sense of safety, which then enables playfulness, right? Because again, players need to be engaged with the system enough that they care about them, intimately familiar enough to be self-expressive and derive internal emotional satisfaction from their actions. All right. So look, at the end of the day, you're going to chart your own course as you learn and figure out what these emotions are like and how intense they should be. But in general, I want you to just remember that in general, you want this to be moving up. The sense of tension and growth as they go through the experience, narratively, gameplay, mechanically, is going up as their skills develop and their powers develop and so on. In this case, this is a fictional sequence, right, that you might imagine like, hey, boom, 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 the town is attacked and you go on a mission to defeat the villain and save the town. And once you beat the villain, well, the pressure's off and you're free to just explore the world, right? But keep in mind, some games can offer multiple tension paths, right? For example, this is Thief, right? And so as you're exploring around, you can decide, or Assassin's Creed, right? It's kind of the same patterns here. You can play a really low tension game. You're playing really carefully, like be really careful and sneak around and handle the guard, and boom, the guard is handled in low tension. Or oh shoot, you get caught and you run away and you hide inside the cloth barrel and wait for the whole thing to reset, right? it's okay to have different tension paths, but make sure the players can figure out the one that works for them and that they're all reasonably viable. All right, so look, in summary, you want to take the time to really consciously chart your course through gameplay and use things like tension, which is the uncertainty between different choices within the game world, and clear emotions to create a varied, interesting experience, right? And sometimes this can be super conscious and planned out. Other times this can be something that you figure out along the way. But if you use this graphing concept, right, this idea of mapping the emotions as they play out through your experience and the levels of intensity, right, how high intensity, low intensity, you can figure out how to tune it and improve it to create that staccato feeling that is really important and really great at locking into players. All right, thank you guys for listening to this course. And if you're interested in stuff like this, my website, gamedesignsskill.com or gamedesignsskill.com, depending on how you pronounce it. You can sign up for an 8-week course. We go over material, all sorts of stuff like this, where I've got designers from Riot, Blizzard, Sony Santa Monica, Bethesda, Activision, Moon Studio, and Jam City, all there, happy to give you guys feedback on your games and ideas. Do that for a free year. Anyways, enough promotion. Thank you guys so much. Let's go ahead and go to some questions.
Hey, thanks, Alexander. We've got time for one or two. So Breeze Lightning asked, do you think the cart in Mario Party 9 and 10 was an example of overcompensating a perceived negative emotion, disinterest, boredom, because they aren't moving at the moment?
That's a really good insight there. Unfortunately, I didn't play enough Mario Party 10 to really say that that was the case or not. In general, Mario Party, though, is about creating a lot of uncertainty, right, and surprise. And so the cart, like everything else, is kind of there just to like mix things up and force disruption within the game, right? Because I remember sometimes the person who won the game would often be the person who was in second or third place, right? Just to give people that sense of you have a chance to make a comeback, just like the blue shell does within Mario Party or Mario Kart itself. Because there's nothing more boring in a game than just always winning or always losing. And Mario Party was one of those games that really acknowledged hey, we intentionally want people of different skill levels interacting and just kind of curse the game or, yeah, I made it, right? All right, let's go to the next one.
I think that was, let me see here. I think that was the last major one. If anybody else has got a question, there was a lot of conversation going on in here. So post it up real quick. In the meantime, I will remind you that Lee's already over in the portfolio review room. So if you want to take advantage of the last art and portfolio review of the conference, that's going on right now. So question, would color theory have any involvement in the pain aspects for players?
Yes. As it so happens, players, I can actually see right now, I'm very primary colored in my current residence, right? Different colors have different emotional responses natively in the human brain. And some of this is cultural, but some of it is biological, right? We are highly attuned to red meaning danger, right? You put a player in overwhelming red space for too long and it dulls their senses and numbs them out, right? That sense of danger is diminished. And so, I think that there's a lot of research there, and I'm certainly not the expert on that, but I try to make sure that whenever I connect a mechanic in the game, I'm really consistent with that color, its importance and relevance. In Ori, right, we connected the color white with the player character and things that were centered around Ori and their power. Ori was non-binary. And things that were related to resources, purchase, and so on. We try to keep really familiar colors, like gold for the embers, the currency, the spirit light that you got within the game. And likewise, when you interact with characters, right, their shape language and so on was very consistent across the whole game. And the artist did so much of that work, I can barely even scratch the surface of it.
Have you played Terraria, and what do you think of it from a design perspective?
It's a very interesting open world game. I enjoyed it for quite a bit. I played it way back, I think about 7 years ago when it first came out. It was kind of rough. There were some really frustrating parts, some really enjoyable parts, but apparently they really expanded that game and had a lot of multiplayer, cooperative experiences and moments. I think it's a good example of where rather than just being completely random, they were rather very varied, right? You didn't know exactly which regions you were going to run into or the sequence that you were going to run into, but you could find them, and eventually you would be able to get all of the features, the resources you needed from each of the regions. But you kind of always had that sense that, hey, off to the right is a little more dangerous, and off to the left is going to be a big adventure and eventually be either a desert or a swamp. And the deeper you go, the scarier it gets until you get to that hell, the lava space. So I really enjoyed it.
So what was your favorite gameplay / narrative combination moment to work on in Ori and the Will of the Wisps? Spoiler friendly if you like.
I absolutely love the escape sequences. I don't want to spoil what they are, but there's this sense of, hey, the player, Ori has done something, and now the world is about to change, and there's some destructive, devastating consequences to some of these decisions, and now the player needs to absolutely get out of the way and deal with whatever they've woken up or destroyed or are trying to just get away from. Probably one of my favorite moments is actually the final battle in Ori and the Will of the Wisps. I don't want to spoil it too much. But that sense of, I'll just give a little bit there, the sense of the world falling away from you and that everything you've known, believed in has fallen away, was really well sold by the boss mechanics that Chris McEntee did for the final fight. And I thought that was phenomenal. So I'm gonna give Chris full marks for that one. Chris and a few others.
All right, one more, and then the rest of them will punt over to the Discord channel. So last one, when observing playtesting, have you found any particularly consistent ways of seeing pain points in players, like when you observe extra body movement if testers are having fun?
Oh man, that's a sensory question. I would highly recommend, I'm just going to send this one over to, you should totally look up micro expressions. Now, micro expressions itself as a science is a little flaky, but it can be really interesting when you're working with a consistent set of playtesters to kind of learn their tells, so to speak. But unfortunately, every human being is so varied, right? Different people respond to different things. I've had people just go steel-faced on me the entire experience. And at the end, I'm like, oh man, they didn't enjoy it all. And they're like, wow, that was really funny and I super enjoyed it. You need to kind of get a read for who the person is before you can find the baseline to know where it is. But generally, things to watch out for: disgust, wince, pain, or like big one to look for surprise, right? Did the surprise moments hit the right time, or did they wear off, or did you run too many surprises back to back?
All right, that's it. So Alexander's going to join us over on the Discord so you can catch up, and I'll move the remaining questions over there momentarily. For right now, I'm going to close this one down, and Dan will be right back with Ethan Levy on Is Your Game Built to Scale? Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.